I'm I'm a member of Parliament from the UK, and it's great to be here. Thank you.
And your name?
It's Chi Onwara.
Excellent. Thank you, Chi. Awesome stuff. Hello, man. You knew I was going to come to you, didn't you? In your heart, you were like, he's going to come to me. I know. What's your name, ma'am?
Skeda Louis from Malawi.
From Malawi. What's Malawi like?
It's warm and the people are friendly for country as well.
I'm coming. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be there. Awesome stuff. All right, please make your way in quickly, guys. Please make your way in quickly. We are about to start. Awesome. Okay. Come on in. Come on in. This gentleman looked at me like, please don't. No, you. All right. Come on in for me, everyone, please. Settle down, settle down, settle down. Lots of people on their phones. Lots of people. Oh, hello. What's your name?
Abhir. Abhir.
Abir. Good to meet you, Abir. Where are you from?
India.
Ah, it's good to have you. It's good to have you here. All right. Okay. Okay. So let's move to our next session. This session is Climate Justice and Leadership for Change in the Commonwealth. The effects of climate change are being felt throughout the Commonwealth, with some member states experiencing global warming as a direct and immediate threat to their economies, their communities, and their way of life. The Commonwealth has a special responsibility to amplify their voices and build meaningful solidarity to protect their interests. The moderator for this session is my wonderful co-host, Victoria Rubidiri, who is an award-winning Kenyan journalist known for her ability to connect with audiences and tell compelling stories. She has worked in radio and television for over a decade, both in Kenya and the United States. Currently, she is a broadcaster on the Kenyan television channel Citizen TV. Victoria co-anchors the popular primetime news program Sunday Live and anchors the Citizen Weekend News Bulletin. Please, 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 welcome to the stage, Victoria Rubidiri. Our next speaker is Dr. Jimmy Fletcher, who was the Minister for Public Service, Information Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science and Technology in St. Lucia from 2011 to 2016. During his tenure, he led an aggressive modernization of the energy sector, commissioned modern ICT centers in several underserved communities, and started a program for free island-wide Wi-Fi. He played a leading role in the Caribbean's 1.5 to Stay Alive civil society campaign, and during the COP21 negotiations was selected by the COP president to be part of the ministerial team that helped to achieve consensus on the elements of the Paris Agreement. He has since written a book on this experience, Negotiating the Paris Agreement, The Insider Stories. Please welcome to the stage, Dr. Jimmy Fletcher. The next speaker on the panel this afternoon is Harjeet Singh. He is a global expert on issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation. He has supported countries across the world on tackling climate change, coordinating emergency response, and disaster resilience programs. He is a senior advisor at Climate Action Network International and serves as a global director, engagement and partnerships at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. He is a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Please welcome to the stage, Harjeet Singh. Now, our next speaker, who is not yet in the room, but apparently he is at another forum and cannot leave until the president leaves. So I'm going to tell you who he is, and he may well join midway through. Maxwell Gomera is a Zimbabwe national. joins the UNDP Rwanda office from UN Environment, where he was the director of the Biodiversity and Land Branch since 2016. He is a resource economist with over 20 years' experience in nature conservation and agriculture. So please, when he does enter the room, you must give him a warm round of applause. Can we practice that warm round of applause, please? There we go. Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Emmanuel Ujirashe Buja. He is the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of the Republic of Rwanda. He is a former president of the East African Court of Justice. He is a Dean Emeritus of the National University of Rwanda Faculty of Law and has given lectures on diverse subjects of law to various well-known universities worldwide. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Emmanuel Ujirashe Buja. I now hand back to Victoria.
Thank you so much, Mark. Excited to get into this conversation around climate justice. And just to give you a bit of context, we know that climate change affects every single country on this planet, but more so and we're talking about the Commonwealth member states that are at the forefront of that. When you're talking about the direct and immediate threat to their economies, their communities, and way of life. And so what this conversation seeks to do is to paint that picture, yes, but also look at what the Commonwealth can do in terms of its special responsibility to amplify their voices and build a meaningful solidarity to protect their interests. And I also should add here that currently, there is no global financing mechanism to support recovery from losses and damages for vulnerable communities and how they can endure that. And that's something that we'll be having up for discussion later on. But this year, which is probably a win for Africa, Egypt will be hosting COP27. And the irony is this will be held on the continent that bears the brunt, the biggest brunt, when it comes to climate change effects. So gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me for this discussion. I'll begin with a question to all of you and to kind of paint a picture of the geopolitical context that we find ourselves in. The war in Ukraine happens to be the crisis of the hour, if I have to use that term. Before that was COVID-19. And when you think about climate change work, and a lot of the resources needed to address that issue with the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, COVID-19, it always seems that when there is a global crisis, climate issues take a backseat, right? And what needs to happen to keep it top of mind, to make it the driving narrative globally, because it's something that affects every country on this planet, as I said earlier. And Dr. Fletcher, let me begin with you on your thoughts, and especially what happens in terms of conversations in COP27 coming up.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the Commonwealth Foundation for inviting me here. Yes, I think every time something happens, it shifts the attention away from climate change, because I believe in people's minds, climate change is something that's gradually happening. It's still a future event, particularly for countries in the global north who are not experiencing it, who are not on the front line like we are. You know, we always say to people that for you, climate change might be an academic discussion. It might still be an esoteric issue. For us, it's an everyday life and death existential issue. We live it every day. My country is currently going through a drought that, while it may not show up there as one of these things that has impacted GDP like a hurricane has, there are farmers who have had to abandon their farms because they just can't get water. Now, what the Russia-Ukraine war has done is that it shifted, particularly in Europe, it shifted the focus to energy security. It has shown just how dependent so many of these countries are on Russian oil and natural gas, and it has made them vulnerable, exposed them. Now, in the long run, that may have some good benefits because I think it's shown them the necessity of energy security and the need to move to more renewable sources. But what has done in the short term is that we've heard Germany is now commissioning coal plants again. Austria is recommissioning a coal plant that it had abandoned because they have to meet their immediate energy needs. So it means that this rapid decarbonization, this rapid removal of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere that we need in order to get global temperatures peaked at 1.5 degrees Celsius is being imperiled by the Ukraine-Russia war because people are now going back to the dirtiest form of energy there is, which is coal. And it's also causing problems with food security. And again, you know, the sad thing is whenever the big countries fight, the little ones are the ones that bear the brunt of it. And the little countries are the ones that now have to deal with oil at 120 US dollars a barrel, food security disrupted because of supply chains, and also wheat not being made available. So there are these issues, but there's also the other costs that I have not yet seen quantified, which is the environmental cost of the war. The damage to ecosystems, the damage to the environment. These bombs that are going up and detonating, how much of a carbon footprint are they putting on our planet? So quite apart from saying the obvious that the war is not good, but the war is very damaging for our efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Harjit, your views on just the knock-off effects from the war in Ukraine?
Well, totally agree with Jimmy, and also remember, we should remember that who are the people who are most vulnerable to all these shocks and stresses? It's the same vulnerable communities and countries who have played a little role in causing the problem, and they are the ones who are facing the brunt of it, whether we talk about food insecurity, energy insecurity, and they are the ones who are suffering the most, and Africa as a continent. And in fact, another thing, when you see more fossil fuel investments happening in Africa, which means it's going to delay the transition that needs to happen in Africa because of the immediate requirement of bridging the gap of oil and gas supplies to Europe and other parts of the world. And another important thing for us to highlight, we talk about climate crisis, COVID, or Ukraine, war in Ukraine. Clearly how interconnected our economies are, how interconnected our ecosystems are, and we have ignored that very fact. Coming from India, which was actually trying to meet the deficit of wheat, in the absence of wheat coming from Ukraine and Russia, India was hit by a massive heat wave, had to stop exports abruptly. So again, a reminder for us, the issues of climate impacts, loss and damage, how real they are, and they are not limited to just one country. It's going to affect the entire global supply chain and systems. So, but that's something which we have not realized. We only look at mitigation as a global action or a global good, but not really dealing with impact. So I think these impacts remind us how interconnected and intertwined our economies and ecosystems are.
Absolutely. Honorable Minister, we've heard about the high energy and food prices, less climate finance, but what in your view do you feel are some of the residual impacts of the current situation in Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much, Victoria. I can't agree more with my fellow panelists. We do feel the consequences in the developing countries more than anyone else, for reasons that my fellow panelists have highlighted. But the main question is, what do we learn from this Ukraine crisis? And I think this is where we should focus as the Commonwealth countries. The first one is, whenever there is a crisis, all the focus everything is refocused to the particular crisis, and especially when it happens in certain parts of the world, Ukraine being part of Europe, and then we lose focus of the most important issues like climate change, and this obviously leads to certain challenges. And the main challenge being that once you don't deal with issues of prevention, that's prevention of catastrophes as a result of climate change, then we will reach a situation where we start dealing with the consequences of climate change. And if there's any lesson that we've learned during the COVID-19 period is, once you reach at that stage where you have to deal with consequences, then it becomes every man or every woman for him or herself. And if you saw that the result during the COVID-19 period was very bad experiences, such as hoarding of vaccines. So you can imagine if we don't come together and prevent the consequences of climate change, once we start facing the consequences, what will happen? So I tend to shudder what will happen, especially to the developing country. Thank you very much.
No, certainly. And, I want to move into the next section of this conversation. And let's talk about solutions, solutions based on justice. So we can kind of move away from the fact that some conversations like this can oftentimes be academic, as you call them, Dr. Fletcher, and actually have some real impact on the ground. Harjit, let me bring you in here. How do we start to direct the discourse and the conversations so that justice is really anchored in the solutions. And we saw that come out quite strongly in the recent IPCC report. But how do we do that effectively?
We first need to understand the concept of climate justice itself. The good thing is over the last few years, you see that terminology of climate justice has become a lot more popular than climate action. But we need to understand what does it really mean. And this is where the challenge is. The negotiations, the climate negotiations have been extremely toxic, if I can use that word, the moment you talk about justice. Because when you talk about justice, it means you have to mention historical responsibility. You have to talk about equity. You have to talk about, who is responsible for the crisis and who is suffering and who has to do the most to deal with the crisis. And this is where we have actually failed in the last 30 years to deal with the issue of climate change. And we have spent 30 years in pointing fingers and blaming each other, than coming together and say, this is a crisis that we have to deal with collectively. Countries or corporations who are responsible for it have to take the bigger responsibility, and we will apply equity and justice principles to support countries and communities who are facing the brunt of it, and also who have to leapfrog to cleaner and sustainable development than following the same dirty model of development which is based on fossil fuels. And if you look at the reality because of which we are still relying on fossil fuels heavily, that's the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem. 86% of emissions come from fossil fuels, carbon dioxide emissions, and that's the reality. Our dependence on fossil fuel remains 80%, which was the case in 2009, 80.3%, and now in 2019, 80.2%. That's the progress we have made. A lot of investment in renewable energy, but where it is going? Feeding the increased demand and not really shifting the problem. So when we talk about justice, we have to talk about who has caused the problem and how do we really tackle that.
No, certainly, and I want to bring in Dr. Fletcher here. In the U.S., Missouri is known as the show me state. And this is now the show me question that goes to you, Dr. Fletcher, in terms of what examples can you speak to or give when we talk about just solutions that make that concrete to this issue?
Yeah, just solutions actually speak to, whatever response we have, ensuring that no one is left behind. And unfortunately, as Harjeet has intimated, that hasn't always been the case. In my region, in the Caribbean contributes, I think, less than 0.2% to global greenhouse gas emissions. My own country, St. Lucia, contributes 0.0015%. I don't know if you could wrap your head around that as a figure. But yet we're the canary in the coal mine, and I hate to use that coal analogy, but that's what we are. But nobody treats us as a canary in the coal mine because we're always the ones who have to make the compromises. As Harjeet said, I mean, I'm a veteran of the negotiation space, and I've grown a little tired and intolerant of it because it focuses on incrementalism, even when all of the reports are saying, this is not a crisis that will happen, this is a crisis that has happened. And the window for dealing with it is not closing, it's almost closed. So yes, we have to look at some of the successes. Now, I think one success we have to look at is what is happening in energy. There is certainly a move in the Caribbean, a country, again, a region, as I said, that makes no contribution to the climate crisis, but saying that we understand that we have a moral imperative to lead, because we can't be speaking and saying to you that you have to reduce on your emissions of greenhouse gases, but giving ourselves a pass. So we are doing it at some cost to us, because unfortunately, the flows of climate finance that have been promised, the $100 billion a year annually from 2020, that was promised by the negotiation space, has not happened. The Green Climate Fund is capitalized only to the tune of around $15 billion. Yet, since we adopted the Paris Agreement in 2015, over $3 trillion worth of subsidies have gone into the fossil fuel sector. So I think if there's one area we need to focus on, it's on energy. And we're seeing that, yes, there is a move towards decarbonizing, particularly the economies in the Caribbean, by moving away from our dependence on fossil fuels. That's one thing we have to look at. Where the just transition argument comes in is ensuring that no one is left behind, because unfortunately, the people who benefit from an energy transition are the ones who can already afford to pay their energy bills. The poor person who can't afford $40,000 to put a solar panel on his or her house, or who has a roof that if you were to try to put a solar panel on it, the roof would collapse, can't benefit from, so there's not a just transition for them. So I think that's one of the areas that, yes, there has been some progress, and it's one solution that is working, but it's another area that we have to look at. Unfortunately, there haven't been too many other solutions, again, because the flows of finance and technical support that we've been waiting for, that we've been promised, and to be honest, that we need, have not come. So there are a lot of things. All of the islands in the Caribbean, all of the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States Community, they've all come up with their climate resilience development strategies. They all have grandiose plans. The government of Dominica, after Hurricane Maria struck in 2017, the Prime Minister boldly stood and he said he would make Dominica the first climate resilient country in the world. This is a country that in 2015, Tropical Storm Erica passed and caused damage equivalent to over 90% of its GDP. 2 years later, they had not yet recovered from Tropical Storm Erica. That Hurricane Maria, a Cat 5++ hurricane, hit them and caused damage equivalent to 226% of their GDP. You know, and they have a whole agenda of making their country climate resilient, but the funds are not flowing. So you will see a lot more solutions and a lot more just transitions taking place if we are to get access to the funding. So I really wish I could stand there and tell you about a lot more of the success stories and the solutions, but I can't, because really you can't ask countries that are so heavily in debt, and heavily in debt because they had to borrow to recover from the previous extreme weather event, the previous drought, the previous flooding. You're now asking them to borrow money again to adapt to climate change, and that's where the justice comes in. I can't see how you could call that justice.
It's a vicious cycle, absolutely, and that deserves a round of applause. Honorable Minister, let's talk policy and see how that can, bring real practice to achieve climate justice. Because it's one thing to be on a piece of paper and have a fantastic guideline or policy, but how do we actually make it practical and implementable as well from where you sit?
Thank you very much, Victoria. I do think there are quite a number of things that can be done in order to ensure that what is agreed in paper and policies is implemented. The first thing that should be done, obviously, and it should start from the executive arm of the governments, that is what we call political will. Sometimes this term is misused, and I fear to use it, but I don't have a proper term to use rather than political will. That is extremely key. And we've seen that there are certain governments which have really gone very far and have political will to implement what they've agreed upon. However, there is also the legislature arm of the government, which holds, whose main duty is to really hold into account what the executive does. It has an important role towards ensuring that whatever is agreed upon is implemented. Then there's the judicial arm of the government, quite key, and we've seen how it has really been at the forefront of dealing with issues of climate change or environmental protection. And this important arm of the government, and I can share with you a few cases. There's a very particular case, a very recent case, the Urgenda case in the Netherlands, which was brought by the Urgenda Foundation. It brought a case against the Netherlands on the basis that the government has not put in place policies to fulfill its international obligations. And the court ruled in favor of Urgenda Foundation that the government had not really put in place policies to fulfill the obligations that it had agreed in the Paris Agreement. And as a result, the government had to rethink its policies, and part of which was to ensure that companies really reduce their carbon footprint. And at the moment, after doing so, we can see more litigations. But we have also a litany of other cases going around the world, basing on that jurisprudence of the Urgenda case in the Netherlands. And so that is the judicial arm. But as a former judge, I will tell you that you can only deal with cases as they come to you because you are at the tail end. And that is why it's important to have an enlightened civil society organization, because most of these cases are brought as a result of public interest litigation by an enlightened civil society. And once you have an enlightened civil society, they will push the barrier. But in doing so, the civil society should be, yes, I do understand that climate change issues do bring out emotions in people, but you also have to be strategic in what you do. If you follow what the courts do and you know that the outcome will be negative, then why, as civil society, bring a case in that country? Why not look at countries where the jurisprudence is progressive in areas of environmental protection? So I do think that everyone does have a role. And once you win a case in a country where the jurisprudence is progressive, then chances are that it will influence jurisprudence elsewhere. So I think that that is how we should approach the issue of implementation of policy. But let me also say this. There are times when you bring a case as a civil society organization before a court, and because of the legal framework that is in existence, it is possible that you will lose in that particular case, but you'll have achieved an objective of putting pressure on either the legislature to change the laws or ensuring that if there was a financing mechanism that was supposed to be geared at a coal plant, as an example, then maybe the banks will be pressurized not to finance that particular project. So you lose the case, but you win the bigger picture that you want to achieve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, giving us some legal tactics in pushing the climate change agenda. Let me bring Maxwell in and just shift gears a bit. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, when we're talking about the just transition, and Dr. Fletcher alluded to it in his comments when he was talking about some just solutions, but what would that ideally look like? And in specific for, you know, workers and communities, what action needs to be done and by whom? How do we identify those players?
Thank you. Some capacity building here. Well, thank you very much, Vicky and Honorable Minister and colleagues. I apologize for being late for this. Despite my best efforts, I just couldn't make it on time, so I really, really apologize. You know, in the middle of March 2019, Cyclone Idai, the worst cyclone to hit the southern hemisphere, killed thousands of people and left millions of others homeless in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. The level of devastation that was left by Cyclone Idai is difficult to fathom, especially for those of us who are one step removed from the area. I started my professional career in an area called Kopa in Chimanimani in Zimbabwe. I was there to help many farmers to set up outgrower schemes. Now, Kopa is in an idyllic setting. It's nestled right between several hills, actually, and slightly, you know, enduring contours. Very beautiful, very green. And perhaps it is this beauty that attracted thousands of farmers to go to the place and try to make a living. But everything changed on the 15th of March. Cyclone Idai struck, killed thousands of people, and left 1.8 million people homeless. Now, what happened in Kopa and other parts of Mozambique and Malawi is not inevitable at all. Although by magnitude, the cyclone was devastating, it is not the only one. In fact, a report that was produced by the IPCC suggested that 90% of the deaths from climate change related deaths are from these extreme events. And this is what makes the conversation that we are having today very important, because we can do something about it. But doing something about it requires that we do it in a just way. And doing it in a just way requires us to have a conversation around 4 issues. The first one is that the transition, first we must do the transition to a low carbon economy. There's no question about it. We must reduce greenhouse gases and we must move to a low carbon economy. Whether you are in a developing country or a developed country, the level of greenhouse gases that we have right now are dangerous to everyone. So we must do our job. But for that to happen, we need 4 things to recognize. The first one is we need access to energy to be just. The second one is we need access to financing. Third, we need access to technology. And fourth, we need just development of human capital. Now, I'll go through each one of those so we can see why they are important. And I'll start with access to energy, because this has created the most controversy in the just transition debate. If you look at some of the questions that have arisen around access to energy, some of them include whether poor countries should be spared the ban on fossil fuels. Because such a ban would undermine economic growth potential for poor countries, including those in Africa. Many of our countries are reliant on coal, they are reliant on gas, and there's been discussion around whether we should allow gas to be a transitional fuel for many of these developing countries. And that is a conversation we must have, because many of the developed nations right now have gotten to where they are using the same. So we must strike an intelligent balance there between annihilating ourselves from climate change, but also ensuring that preventing that annihilation is just. The second question is whether developed nations recognize that poor countries are already sequestering more carbon than they are emitting. And as such, there's support needed to invest in those poor countries as they transition to fuels, to other cleaner fuels to accelerate energy access. The second one around access to finance is that the transition itself is not cost neutral. It will cost money. Consider this. The funding required for energy transition in Africa alone will be $170 billion per year up to 2030. That amount is 3 times more than the overseas development assistance that Africa received in 2019, prior to COVID. And even prior to COVID, ODA was going down. So where will that funding come from? This is something that we've got to resolve and bring the combined power of the Commonwealth to focus on how we can mobilize funding to enable that transition. Third, the transition requires technology. The deal that South Africa struck at COP26 is based on the ability of South Africa to access hydrogen technology. But consider this minor example. Last year, I'm based here. I'm the resident representative of UNDP. And last year, I wanted to do the right thing. I wanted to change the diesel car that we've been using for the past 12 years to an electric car. We approached most major car producing firms, including Mercedes-Benz, BMW, VW, which is even based here, and asked if they could sell us an electric car. The answer we got was, we are not ready for Africa. Now, how is Africa supposed to make the transition to low carbon economy if the technology that's needed is denied to Africa? So this is a question that we need to be answering as we look into this just transition. But also there's this thorny issue of transition fuels, gas. Should we be allowing countries to use gas as a transition fuel? while they work on that. The South Africans have said it will take them something close to 15 to 20 years to convert Sasol into a hydrogen plant. But meanwhile, they will need gas as a transition fuel. So we need to be recognizing that. Finally, the transition requires a new genre of skills. If you look at the South Africa deal, the people who are working at Sasol right now will require upskilling. They will require to be employed somewhere. There are millions of people who are dependent on that power plant. And we need to be thinking about how do we develop those new skills to absorb people who have been working in those industries. But also, there's a positive light there. How do we develop young people so they can take advantage of the opportunities that a green economy offers? We've been talking this morning to startups, and this is part of why I was delayed. We've been talking to startups here in Rwanda who are working on new green technology. How do we mobilize the funding as the Commonwealth to ensure that we become the global powerhouse of new green technologies that are, championed by young people, women, and all the people who are involved in this? That requires political commitment. And that requires the whole of the Commonwealth to come together to do that. But it also requires banks to start thinking and looking at financing startups, at financing people who are looking into this with a different eye. At the moment, it is very difficult for young people to access capital from the banks, especially here in Africa. Banks look at Africa in a different way, and the cost of capital is quite high. So we need banks and financing institutions to start thinking more creatively about how they can support a transition to a green economy. But we also need businesses to be adventurous. We also need businesses who take risk, financial risk, and many other risks, because that is the only way we can achieve a greener economy and a just economy.
Dr. Fletcher, that definitely deserves a round of applause. Dr. Fletcher, I have to ask this because, Maxwell talked about all of these factors that need to be in place, when it comes to access to energy, finance, technology, human capital, but the political will oftentimes is a missing ingredient in all of this. And we can't say that a lot of the climate change demands aren't clear. They are. And we have countless documents that paint this out. But why is it that whenever we come to this issue of just solutions, it is unable to drive the political agenda? How do we begin to make it part and parcel of what politicians, policymakers, ministers are talking about?
I think because climate change is still viewed as an environmental problem. So climate change is left to the ministers of environment, or whatever they called, in their respective jurisdictions to deal with. Climate change is not an environmental problem. Climate change is a human rights problem. It is a social problem. It is an economic problem. And it is an environmental problem. It's a cultural problem. So until the entire cabinet of ministers in the country understands that by not tackling climate change, they are putting their entire development agenda at risk, or in fact, there's no way they can achieve their development agenda, we will not get political will. Until the Prime Minister is not invested in what goes on at COP. So he or she speaks to his or her Minister of the Environment and tells that Minister of the Environment first of all finds out, what are you discussing at COP? What do you expect to get from COP? What just happened in Bonn? What's loss and damage? What is happening with loss and damage? How is that helping me deal with the issues in my country? Until that happens, you will not get political will, because we know that until it reaches the ears of the Minister for Finance or the Prime Minister, and sometimes the Prime Minister is also the Minister for Finance, it doesn't happen. The Minister of Finance is the one who controls the purse strings and is the one who determines the political and economic and social and environmental agenda of the country. It's that simple. So until we get people to understand that climate change is not an environmental problem, it is a problem that impacts every single sector. The Caribbean depends on tourism. Many of our countries, mine included, depend on tourism. But how can someone come to St. Lucia or the Bahamas looking to dive to hope to see Nemo when Nemo is no longer there because the coral reefs have been destroyed? And the coral reefs have been destroyed because of warmer temperatures and ocean acidification, because the oceans are being caused to absorb more carbon dioxide, because the more carbon dioxide we put out into the atmosphere, people believe that the forests and the trees are the only sinks, the only ones that absorb carbon dioxide. But our oceans absorb carbon dioxide. So the more carbon dioxide we belch out into the atmosphere is the more carbon dioxide our oceans have to absorb. As they absorb them, chemistry 101, carbon dioxide mixes with water, causes carbonic acid, ocean gets more acidic. As the ocean gets more acidic, coral reefs start to die out, and if you're like me and you don't eat meat and you depend on shellfish, your shellfish can't form shells, so my food security is also at risk now. So when the Minister of Tourism understands that, and the Minister of Agriculture understands that, and the Minister of Infrastructure understands that it doesn't matter how much money you put into fortifying your defenses, that may come to naught. If this juggernaut of global warming continues at the pace that it's going, then you're going to have a problem. If the Minister of Health does not understand that you will see an increase in vector-borne diseases because your water cycle is becoming so variable. So things like Zika and chikungunya and dengue and malaria that you thought you had under control, you don't have under control anymore because, one, temperatures are getting warmer. So you have, and it's known fact that mosquitoes bite more frequently when the temperatures are warmer. So you have a mosquito biting on steroids. You have a protozoan forming in that mosquito, be it Plasmodium falciparum like you have in Rwanda that causes malaria, or some other protozoan that is developing quicker because the temperatures are warmer. So you have issues. I worked in Dominica for 6 months after the passage of Hurricane Maria. People underestimate the impact of these extreme weather events on mental wellness. You know, for the 6 months I worked there were 3 pending storms. Luckily, none of them happened. The state of panic that people went into, just thinking about what they experienced just a few months ago after Maria passed, and you know the frenzy that took place with buying and hoarding, you know, putting up shelters and everything. People started to worry about going back into hurricane shelters, which is not the most pleasant of experiences. And if you want to talk about equity, you know, the plight of women and children in hurricane shelters is not a good one. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, but until we start understanding that we have to factor climate change into everything that we do. And climate change is not the sole preserve of the Minister of the Environment, but every single minister, the Minister of Education. You know, the last set of people to get back to normal are parents and children. Why? Because the schools are used as hurricane shelters. So when you evacuate the last set of people out of your schools, that's the only time the children can go back to school. If the children don't go back to school, the parents' lives are not normal. So when we get everyone to understand how pervasive and how much climate change impacts every single element of our lives. And I think that's why it's difficult for the global north to understand this climate change discussion, because it does not live it the way we do. It does not experience it the way we experience it. And it doesn't see, if Hurricane Sandy passes through the United States, it hits the eastern seaboard. So New York, lives in New York are affected, but everybody else, their lives are normal. When Hurricane Maria passed through Dominica, there was not one life that was normal. And the same with any extreme weather event that passes through a Pacific SIDS, an AIM SIDS, a Caribbean SIDS, or an African country. It affects every single one of us. So that is where I think we have to elevate that level of anxiety among our politicians so that they understand just how impactful this is now, and it'll get even worse. If you look at the IPCC reports, it'll get even worse in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher. It reminds me of how we underestimated the impact of a public health crisis on life in general. So it definitely is part and parcel with what we deal with. Let's segue into a few questions. Any questions from, I can see some hands up. So let's get some mics. So let me start with the lady in the gray sweater. We'll come to the gentleman in the pink, or is it salmon shirt? So let's start with the lady in the gray. Let's get a mic to her, please. So raise your hand, please, ma'am. She's right over here. And we'll give just a few minutes. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you very much. My name's Chion Wara. I'm a British Member of Parliament for Newcastle in the northeast of England, and I'm here with a delegation from our all-party parliamentary group for Africa, which seeks to support the African diaspora in the UK in relationships between the UK and African countries. And I just want to thank you for this. You're absolutely right to say that this kind of debate, which sort of puts in the foreground the experiences of those on the front line of the fight against climate change, and also African and developing countries' perspective. We just don't have enough of that. We don't have enough of that, particularly in the UK and in the global north, as was said. And I suppose my question is two questions. So my constituents in Newcastle, they tend to hear about climate change as something that means they need to stop eating meat in order to protect the polar bears. You know, how do we make it much more real and tangible for everyone, that, you know, these your experiences, and what can the African, particularly, or the Commonwealth diaspora do to help that? And then I suspect, I'm responsible for science and innovation for my party, and I suspect that a lot of the solutions to mitigate climate change don't have enough research and development investment in them. Or is it that they are there and they don't have enough financial investment in rolling them out?
Fantastic. I'll field that to the panel. Anyone want to respond? Maxwell? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, and I think that's a really important question. You know, the climate change is something that most people feel disengaged from, yeah? And it's only important when it hits next door. So you're absolutely right. How can we change that? I think that we've got to start telling the stories differently, and we've got to personalize them a little bit. When I started, I was telling you about the people in Copper, where I started working. These are people I knew. They are not there anymore. And there are thousands of such stories across Africa. And I think we need to start to honor them by telling their stories and how climate change has hit them. So that's number one, and the media has got to play an active role in that. You as parliamentarians, I think you also have an important role to play. I have always wondered why, when it came to mobilizing resources for COVID-19, the purses were easy to open. But when it comes to looking for money for something that's also equally tragic as climate change, we struggle. So we would like to hear from you. Is it because we're not telling the story and you don't have the tailwind, is that called the tailwind? The support of the constituencies behind you? Because if that's the case, then we all have a responsibility to tell the story so that you have the electoral support that you need to move these issues forward. On the solutions, I think we have the solutions. What we're not doing is we're not implementing them. We don't need more science. It's fine to have a dashboard of science that's telling us how, a library of how things are going bad. But it's just a library. We've got enough evidence right now to act.
Thank you. If I may add to what Maxwell said, I think it's really important to put people at the center, and he refers to media. And I think yesterday or day before I was looking at one of the tweets where your media agency, The Sun, was characterizing how heat wave is affecting people and how people are coping. So there was a picture of a lady having ice cream and people enjoying in the fountain. But when you look at heat wave in our part of the world, people are losing lives. I was referring to the wheat production going down. It's causing hunger, crisis of nutrition. So it's the way we look at it. So if we keep talking about polar bear, who are important for our ecosystem, and not about people who are getting impacted, we can't shift the discourse. And the impact of the same disaster, as Dr. Fletcher was saying, in the global north, and it's very different in the global south, where people, you know, they are losing their economy, they're losing people, they're losing, you know, their farms and income. But the discourse in the global north, somehow, despite having such global media, lives in its own bubble. And I'll tell you, if I may, connect that, a terminology that I used very recently in Bonn. People are now linking the lack of climate action with racism, with climate apartheid. Because I was talking to a delegation from a global north country, and the whole issue of loss and damage. And I said, you are the ones who blocked the conversation on loss and damage. And loss and damage, to tell you, it means how people recover from impacts. And there was a conscious effort to confuse that with adaptation. And we said adaptation is something that you do before the event. When people are losing their homes, it's about relief, it's about recovery, it's about rehabilitation. And it was a deliberate effort not to even talk about loss and damage because of the whole liability and compensation issue. And you know what that country delegation, head of the delegation said? Now we understand adaptation is different from loss and damage because we had massive floods last year. We are now beginning to realize. We have been sharing all these examples over the last 20 years. Island states talked about the issue of sea level rise in 1991. Nothing was done. But now that impacts are being felt in the global north, you say, now you are beginning to recognize. I was in Bonn for the last 2 weeks. Everybody, all countries now recognize that there is something called loss and damage, which means impacts are hitting. And they've agreed to talk about it, not to do anything about it. So I think we need to really connect the perspective of policymakers, how they look at global south, and how they deal with it. Maxwell, what you talked about, what needs to happen. Technology is available, but why technology is not being transferred? Why finance is not being provided? In the name of climate finance, 71% were loans. Imagine we are actually asking poor people, poor countries to take loan for climate action, for mitigation, for adaptation. And Mozambique, after twin cyclones, had to go to IMF to get loans. Where are we putting these countries in that debt cycle which they will never be able to come out of? So we really need to look at very seriously, and you can raise those issues in the parliament, that how we are dealing and treating the global south.
I think also people involved in the climate change space are lousy communicators. We have to take some of that responsibility. It's only since civil society got involved in that climate space that these arguments have been deconstructed and put forward in a way that everybody can understand. Because climate change negotiators like to talk about GHG and gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent and all of these things that really make your eyes glaze over and your head spin. And it was one of the things that I decided when I became a minister and I got involved in that space. And after my first briefing from my technical people, I said, hold on. Yes, I do have a training in science, so yes, I do understand this, but please treat me like I do not understand a thing about climate change and explain it to me in a way that I can explain it to others. And I've made it my mission since then to always try to explain climate change to someone in the way that I would want it explained to me if I didn't understand anything. So that's part of the problem. If you've only been told about not eating meat because eating meat causes there has to be more intensive livestock production, and that'll cause an increase in production of methane gas and polar bears. You can't connect with that. And as Hajit said, when it is put in a manner that everybody understands, so that it doesn't matter whether you're in Islington, you in New York, wherever you are, you could understand what climate change means, how it's affecting other people and how it will affect you, then you start to make the connection. So we have to take responsibility because we are lousy communicators.
I think contrary to your opinion, though, Minister, you're actually a very good communicator on climate issues. I understood everything you said. I'll come to you, sir, but let's come to the gentleman in the pink shirt because we need to continue with the conversation. Let's get a mic to him.
Okay, thank you. My name is Modeste Zenfand. I'm coming from Cameroon. Today, I think my dream will come true. Because when I hear the intervention of each other of you, I'm very happy. And I say, it's better to me to tell you that the solution that we are there to find, to eradicate the poverty in Africa, in another world, we are there since, me and our group, to work since 6 years. But we have the problem. When we explain our solution and tell the man that that is the solution which can make us to to develop each other, you say, is the dream. When I hear that if you come and CHOGM, you can have the solution, you can have in French we say the accompagnement, the soutien of Commonwealth, because Commonwealth is there to accompany someone who have the great solution to permit us to get out the poverty. In our group, because I'm the founder of one cooperative, which have the solution that we call I want to say in the French, solution the business school, because we want to permit all the youth, or all one who have finished of the school, and we are there to go to Europe to find the work, because they have the technical. We want, with our business school, to permit them to develop their mindset, their opportunity to create something, and to be with the men, the Commonwealth, and transfer the technology, the Europe to Africa. And the problem is, we support us to start with this kind of business school. The second problem is the financial institution. We know that in my country, there is not what you call in French banque d'investissement. We have also the banque d'épargne et de crédit. To get the credit to do your business is too difficult. And if you have the credit and you have the challenge to develop your business, wow, you can take it like what you call in French AVC. Because bank will ask you, I don't care about your business is not going on.
Yeah, allow me to interrupt. If you have a climate-related question, because we also are very limited on time, we can probably keep this conversation for a bit later, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, my question is, how can we do to get the soutien of Commonwealth to start and make the business school, the investment bank, and what we call the cautionnement mutuel. The cautionnement mutuel, we want we want all the person we need financial to be in a caution mutuel, because if there is a problem, the system of caution mutuel will take the risk of the problem. How can we do? Because we are there to be in Commonwealth and get the soutien of Commonwealth to start the support of Commonwealth. Thank you. The support of Commonwealth and bring up the solution that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. But I don't think any of my panelists can respond to that right now. In the interest of time, we'll have that directed to the Commonwealth team who are here. They've heard your question and taken note of that. But we have to move on swiftly to conclude this conversation really quickly, gentlemen. So, Maxwell, you talked about incorporating the Commonwealth in driving this agenda. And how does it effectively utilize the multilateral space, more effectively? And what pressure points can they start kind of hitting at when it comes to pushing for a climate change agenda, and keeping in mind what's going to happen in Egypt in a few months' time with COP27?
Okay, I hope I understood the question very well. But, Vicky, thanks for that. The transitions we're talking about require multiple conversations across society. So I'm delighted that civil society is taking the initiative here to start the same conversation. They also require thought leadership and new ideas. But they also require new agreements for collective action across governments and across society. And I think in those three spaces, that's where the Commonwealth can play a constructive role. The Commonwealth can broker these conversations as a group. It can be a partner in thought leadership, because we do need someone to be saying, there is the North Star. And as 54 countries of the Commonwealth, we agree that we are committing to ensuring that loss and damage, for example, is there's a decision on loss and damage in the COP 27, or any other issue that might come up using the power of the Commonwealth. But the Commonwealth can also engage in new agreements around these issues. For example, the most urgent issue I would suggest is the issue of mobilizing new forms of climate finance. And the Commonwealth, I would suggest, must explore how carbon markets can play a role in bringing down emissions first, but also in transforming economies. African countries have struggled to access the $890 billion carbon market that exists out there. The sheer volatility of prices in the carbon markets and the complexity of the deals that we are talking about have made it impossible for most countries to access those markets. But that's where the Commonwealth can play a major role. Here in Rwanda, we are looking at two things. First, we're working with the government to drive a carbon trade exchange. That's not just for Rwanda, that's for any country in the Commonwealth and across the continent, to see if a carbon trade exchange might be helpful. But we are also looking into government-to-government agreements on carbon. And this is where I think the Commonwealth can do a wonderful dance as well. At the moment, it's very difficult for individual countries, let alone countries like Rwanda here, to negotiate with giants in Europe on an appropriate and a reasonable price for carbon. The price for carbon ranges from $5 per ton to $200 per ton. Now, I was talking to one of the banks that are leading across the continent, and they said, well, we've locked ourselves into a $5 per ton agreement. But that is not sufficient to make any transformations across any of the industries. President Biden last year offered American companies $185 per ton. Now, this is the same carbon. It's not like America has pimped up carbon, and we don't. So why would one country be offering $185 and then another country is offering $5? This is where the Commonwealth can play a very constructive role and approach its memberships and say, you know what, we'll do the trading within. And we are offering $200 per ton. Or whatever it is that can enable companies within an economy to make that transition. And this is the final point. Here, we're working with many companies, including Ampersand, if many of you might know it, who are trying to convert many of the motorbikes that you see on the roads from being petrol-powered motorbikes to electric motorbikes. But in order for them to do so, first, the cost of the technology has to be at least lower than the current cost of petrol-powered technology, or at least at par. Now, the technology is expensive, and we are seeking to bridge that gap with other financing. Where will that financing come from? This is where we would like to see the Commonwealth playing a leadership role, and the thought leadership role.
Fantastic, and certainly tapping into that camaraderie that exists within the Commonwealth. Dr. Fletcher, let's go a bit controversial here, because a lot of people in this room would say, okay, great, but we also know what the Commonwealth represents in terms of the colonial legacy. So how can it then be the vehicle for new thinking, for decolonizing, and especially when it comes to small and vulnerable countries, how does it become the driver and the platform on which that fresh and new thinking is actually put on?
That's a very good question. I want to applaud the Commonwealth for putting it in there. Excellent question. Accepting your historical past and looking forward. Just continuing from what Max said. The Commonwealth is a really unique group of countries. There are countries that are developed, like the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and you have countries that are developing, countries at various levels of vulnerability, countries with varying levels to respond to vulnerability. So I think one of the things that the Commonwealth can do is cause that exchange of information that is so, for example, we don't learn from the experiences of others. When I worked in Dominica after the passage of Hurricane Maria, I saw how people who probably had not been impacted by the hurricane itself were impacted by the conditions after the hurricane. So disabled people, people who were chronically ill and needed access to insulin or dialysis, their insulin could not be refrigerated because the power grid was down. So you now have people who may not have been killed by Maria, but may be killed in the aftermath because they can't treat themselves properly. People who need dialysis, first of all, you don't even know where these people are. So the emergency organization in a particular community or even nationally does not know where the disabled people live, so it can ensure that it can clear the roads and get access to them. Now, imagine in the best of circumstances, our infrastructure, our physical infrastructure makes it difficult and challenging for them to get around. Can you imagine in the aftermath of a hurricane where able-bodied people cannot get around, what that does to disabled people? They are powerless. And I know the last thing any disabled person wants to think of themselves as is powerless, but that's what a disaster does. We have not learned from the experiences of our neighbors within that Commonwealth society, that Commonwealth community, so that we can cause other countries to put in place mechanisms to ensure that nobody else suffers that same fate. The Commonwealth Charter, I think, speaks very clearly to what the Commonwealth is about. You're about promoting youth. You're about promoting civil society. Civil society is an extremely important component of this response to climate change. You are probably the one organization of the Commonwealth Foundation that gives civil society a voice, but also brings in members of the political directorate so that they can hear that voice. And doing it in the margins of CHOGM means that the highest levels of political decision-making in the Commonwealth can hear what civil society is saying. That is a very powerful tool that needs to be used to its maximum potential so that the leaders who, quite frankly, don't like engaging with civil society until they've reached the end of the election cycle and they need civil society's votes, you can cause them to now speak to civil society on a regular basis so that they hear what civil society is saying. Also, transfer of technology. I think that's very important. You have countries with varying levels of technological access and production of technology. If the Commonwealth can serve as a space to cause that technology to flow in that direction, then you would be restoring or you would be righting some of the wrongs of your historical past, if I'm going back to that beautiful construct of that question. So yeah, I would point to those three: engaging civil society, transfer of technology, but also lessons learned, so that we can all, it makes no sense for us to continue repeating the mistakes that others, or the bad experiences that others had, for us to repeat them. The Commonwealth can cause that to happen.
Right. Harjit, you wanted to respond?
I'm tempted to add to what Dr. Fletcher said. I think the role of Commonwealth has been a complete missed opportunity in the climate space. So there's a common history that Commonwealth shares, common pain that colonies share, and there's so much that can be shared as a Commonwealth in real terms, as you said: technology, human capital, as you said, finance, based on equity, who needs more? But we never had those conversations, and we have still seen how countries who are living the legacy of colonialism and who are stuck with coal or with other fossil fuels, they have not been given a helping hand to really come out of it. And instead we got into, when you go to climate spaces, you don't even feel there is something called Commonwealth, the kind of finger pointing and blame game that you see in that space. So I think it's a clear missed opportunity, and still it has been very extractive in nature. I think we need to really move beyond that, and we need to bring the spirit of solidarity, we need to bring the spirit of cooperation that has been missing all this while. And I would also say that, as in the journey of last few decades, some countries have really evolved. So countries like India, South Africa, Kenya, bigger economies must also come forward and share their technology, their finance. When I speak to my country, I was invited to talk about loss and damage. I say, the kind of institutions you have, when you go to the space and talk about loss and damage, even if you are facing massive loss and damage, you have a lot to share in terms of your scientific advancement in the field of oceans. You have great satellite systems which can assist countries, nearby countries and beyond. So there's a lot of sharing, exchange that can happen with that spirit, but that has not been happening because we've never used the space as a more catalytic kind of a forum.
And injecting a controversial piece, to do some group therapy when group therapy is necessary. So when you have a country like Australia misbehaving, the couple can get together and cause Australia. Now, fortunately, we've had a change in government in Australia, so we should see a better behavior by Australia in the negotiating space. But if we have to be frank, and in the spirit of the question that was asked, Australia has caused a lot of the grief for many of us developing countries in this climate change negotiating space over the years. So if the Commonwealth can cause some group therapy to cause Australia, if it were ever to misbehave again, to understand the common plight, the common pain, then I think that would be. I had to inject some controversy because it was a controversial question.
Why only leave it to?
Thank you, absolutely. I'll never look at group therapy the same again. I think at this juncture, I want to bring in Honorable Minister really quickly and just kind of go down the legal route a bit. And I'll bring you in, Dr. Fletcher, on this too, because when you're looking at legal litigation and a body like the Commission of Small Island States to be used to advance climate justice, especially in the multilateral space, to push for developed countries to live up to that loss and damage financing that Harjeet was talking about, how do we use those avenues? Legal litigation, for instance, and from where you sit. I know you talked about some tactics that could be used by the civil society, but in a practical sense, for the small island nations and vulnerable nations, how can they use those legal avenues?
So I do think the legal avenues at the multilateral level are very limited, and they're only limited to, at the moment, if I'm not wrong, to advisory opinions at the ICJ. And advisory opinions, first of all, in their nature, are not binding the outcome of it. But even more difficult is how you arrive at having the ICJ pronouncing itself in an advisory opinion. I am alive to the fact that a number of students have come together and I think convinced Vanuatu to begin the process of having having ICJ pronouncing itself in an advisory opinion. But the challenge will be that you have to convince all the UN General Assembly members in order for them to seek a question from the ICJ, which is not a very easy task. So that is the only room that I can see at the multilateral level. But let me say this. If most of us come together in the Commonwealth, then we could be able to convince, when you come together as many as the 54 members of the Commonwealth, then this is a strong voice which could compel other countries to be able to join that particular group. And I saw it with the advisory opinion on the Chago Archipelago, where the African Union spoke with one language, and all the countries started coming together in order to support that move of the African countries. So I think that is important. But let me conclude by saying that in my former life as a dean and as a judge, I have been a strong proponent of an environmental court as an idea, a world environmental court. And the reason being simply that I do believe that my rationale for this is that for global challenges, you need global solutions. And for global disputes, because climate change is not, does not have borders, it transcends borders. So you do need a global dispute resolution mechanism, which in my own opinion is a World Environmental Court. Whether we will achieve that, that's another question, but I do believe that we need one. And unfortunately, we don't have we only have a very small room of opportunity to really reverse the impacts of climate change. And one of those solutions is having a World Environmental Court. Thank you.
I think that's an awesome recommendation. The only issue is we have come across, we as small island developing states and developing countries and climate vulnerable countries have come across this firewall of resistance to issues of liability and compensation where loss and damage is concerned. Because for those who do not know, loss and damage refers to not just the extreme weather events, but also slow onset impacts. So things like sea level rise, ocean acidification, these things are also considered part of the loss and damage because these are irreversible. They're beyond your limits of adaptation. So there's certain things that you can adapt to. But if your oceans have become acidic because of all of the carbon dioxide that they've had to absorb, it's not like a human being that you could now take an antacid and neutralize the acidity in your stomach. You can't dump Diavol or Malox or something into your ocean to neutralize it. Your oceans have become irreversibly acidic. If a country, Kiribati is now in danger of losing an entire country. There are islands in the Bahamas that are disappearing. Marshall Islands, so many small island developing states are disappearing. Jakarta, cities are under threat. There's nothing you could do to adapt to that. There's no seawall that you could build to cause that to change. Now, somebody has to take responsibility for this. But whenever we speak of loss and damage, the developed countries, and I came across this, the number of discussions and arguments and debates that we had in the build-up to COP21, where developed countries were saying to you, the only way you will ever see loss and damage as a separate element in the Paris Agreement is if you renounce all rights to liability and compensation, that we will not have any discussion on liability and compensation. You know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of the fights that civil society had with the tobacco industry, refusing to take responsibility for a drug that was killing people and saying, well, it's not just tobacco causing lung cancer, or we didn't tell you smoke. Well, you're the ones putting out the carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and you're the ones causing Kiribati to disappear. Kiribati is not a whole bunch of people from Kiribati jumping up and down that's causing the island to disappear. You're making it disappear. These monster storms that you're seeing, you're the ones causing it, and there's a field of science now called attribution science that allows us to specifically determine how much of the impact of a disaster has been caused by climate change. So I welcome any thought of an environmental court, but I know, judging from the kind of resistance we've gotten to loss and damage, we'll have problems. But you know who can help? You can. Civil society can. Because if we just leave it to the politicians to argue, compromises will be made, back deals will be made. So the environmental court will morph into something that none of us will recognize. But if you as civil society say, this is what we want, and we will not stop. One of the reasons we got 1.5 in the Paris Agreement and we got loss and damage, I can never forget in Le Bourget, seeing Greenpeace and a bunch of civil society organizations take over a hall and just chanting for loss and damage on 1.5. Civil society did that. So civil society has that responsibility. Maybe, Minister, with UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, maybe we can anchor some of these challenges, but I think a World Environmental Court would be the best way to do it, but we will not be able to do it on our own. We need you to champion it.
Fantastic. And that is the perfect segue into our final Q&A. I promised we'll come to you, sir. Can we get a mic to the gentleman right in the front, please? Right in the front, yeah. Come all the way up. We'll take the next few minutes for questions before we wrap. Thank you.
Yes, Richard Reeser, Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. Big questions we're talking about, and what I want to say on disabled people is quite marginal to it, but quite important. I think we shouldn't really be involved with carbon offsetting, because that's the excuse that the polluters came up with, so they didn't have to do anything. I don't think you should have anything to do with it. I think you should use the natural resources here to create energy. 3% of the world's naturally produced energy would solve the energy problem. Focus on that, get resources for that, employ people to do that, train people to do that, and develop your own technology with your own copyrighted materials. Forget the North. Really. Put up the barriers against the North, because they are destroying you and destroying your livelihoods. So, a little point then, going back to what our friend from the Caribbean said, yes, disabled people are the first to be, or the last to be affected and the first to be damaged by this. And all countries should now, under Article 11 of the Convention, which all the countries here bar two have signed up to, should have accident and emergency prevention systems that are disability proof, which means that in Dominica they should have known where all the disabled people were. They should have mapped them as part of the emergency procedure. They should have had rehearsals to know how to get those people out, how to fly drones with their drugs to them, etc. This is not rocket science. We have all the capabilities of doing this. Countries should be forced to do what they've signed up to do, so that it isn't always the person who's left behind who drowns in the floods. You know, they don't need to. This is wanton destruction of people's lives that I'm afraid to say we still don't think are equal. Disabled people do not feel equal in the Commonwealth, and that's why we've set up the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, to keep reminding everybody that we do need to be treated equally, as do other groups who are oppressed and out. But we need to take a much stronger line on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Anyone want to chime in?
Well, I just wanted to let him know that the reason Hajit and I started laughing is because this question of carbon offsetting caused us to remain behind for 2 hours last night arguing about the merits and demerits of carbon offsetting, which we will not go into here because it means we'll have another 3 hours, which we don't have. But you're right, there are issues there. But, you know, the sad thing is, you say Dominica should have known. What's even sadder for me is that nobody has learned from Dominica's experience. So if a hurricane were to hit, heaven forbid, any one of the other islands in the Caribbean, you'll find that they are still at the same point. And that's why a project that I'm involved with, the Caribbean Climate Justice Project, we're actually piloting something in St. Lucia to do that, to actually now geolocate all the disabled people and all of the people who are chronically ill and need access to medication, so that in the event something like this happens, we have some way of identifying them, knowing who they are, and getting assistance to them right away.
Just to add, and totally agreeing with you, I think we somehow undermine the role of governments in dealing with the crisis. We think that market solutions are going to deal with it, but you know, we have been hearing, you know, around the room that it's not happening. Banks are not changing their policies. Corporates are not investing because they don't find Africa profitable. And do you think one fine day they'll get up and say, oh, now we have to transform Africa at the cost of their own profits? They will never do that. It's always governments who made things happen. Any transformation you look at, the idea comes from civil society. You push governments to take it up, then governments through regulation, through those investments, as you very rightly said, brings about a change, and that's how change has happened anywhere in the world. You pick up any sector. Coming from India, I can tell you, India is seen as a leader in pharmaceutical. Do you think industry did it on its own? No. Government created that environment to do that. IT industry, government did that. We had a massive change from incandescent bulbs to LED. With just a little bit of time we spent on CFLs. That transition happened because governments wanted that. There's a revolution happening on electric bike. Do you think industry is doing on its own? No. Government is making it happen. So the role of government to regulate, to set policies, to guide the industry, support and create that enable environment, and the banking industry, only then things happen. So role of government is extremely important. Some of these schemes like offsets, and now we are hearing geoengineering. You know what we call them as civil society? Dangerous distractions. You know, some would call it false solutions, we would call it dangerous distraction. You are not dealing with the issue straight, you are trying to hold your ear like this. You know? Just come straight to the point. We need to reduce emissions, and we don't have to look for schemes that's going to divert, delay. We've lost 30 years. Why are we talking of loss and damage? We didn't do anything on mitigation. Emissions continue to rise. Markets have been there. We've been hearing about carbon capture and storage. Where are those machines which have captured that carbon? Oceans are capturing and causing havoc, right? These are the natural things, but we kept polluting. Have we supported people to adapt? No, we talked about adaptation in 2001. 21 years, no resources. What are we facing? Loss and damage, because we left it to market. 30 years, we left everything to the market. Result is in front of you. Had government stepped up, taken action, it would have been a different place.
We'll take one more round of questions in the interest of time, and a request if we can keep the questions short and climate related, please. That would be fantastic. So I'll come to the gentleman right here, and then I need to get a lady in the mix. Right there in the middle. Can you stand up, ma'am, please, if we get the mic to you? Great. Let's start with you, sir.
So mine is an observation and possibly a question. We have talked today, but our discussions are very gender blind. we are doing a lot of generalizations that climate change affects all of us, but it affects women and girls quite differently and disproportionately. So I will not enter into the technical language of social norms, behaviors, attitudes, gender relations, power dynamics. I want to keep it simple. If we have a climate crisis and we have less food, women are going to suffer more, and girls, because they either have to get out of school and look for food, work for food, go further to find food, and they're actually deprioritized when it comes to the actual eating, because they're girls and women. If we have an energy crisis, girls and women have to spend more time looking for energy sources. And I know it's good to say we can have alternative energy sources, but in many rural communities, you only have one option, actually. So then we talk of displacement when disasters happen. It also affects women and girls quite disproportionately, because now they're displaced, they are more at risk, right, with the prevailing environment. Because things like menstrual hygiene management in disasters become so complicated, and they lead to a lot of exclusion happening. So we also talk about access to household income. When household income is depressed, the issues and priorities for girls and women are deprioritized as well. Healthcare, education, menstrual hygiene management, commodities, and all these things. So in our discussion, we must be very clear about how it affects these groups differently and come up with strategies that respond. So throwing it back to all of you gentlemen, I've not heard the mention of gender or gender-sensitive climate justice approaches in your talk today. So I'm just wondering what you have up your sleeve. Maybe you're going to surprise us in the last part of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, and how refreshing for a gentleman to bring up the gender question. I'll have the panelists respond really quickly before we take the last question.
Awesome intervention, absolutely. And every single one of our countries has incorporated this into their climate plans. We see it. So we don't even have to wait for climate change. Every time there's a hurricane that strikes our country, two things go down: the water grid and the electricity grid. Who are the ones most affected? The women. The women and the girls are the ones who have to go out to get water. Wherever water is, they have to go out to get it. They don't have transportation, but they're the ones who have to go out to get it. When the energy is down, you're right. So we see it every day, and that's why I say that climate change is not an academic discussion for us. So we don't even have to think of how do we incorporate gender in this. We live that gender imbalance every single day. So we're very alive to it, we're very alert to it, we understand it. But again, these things, these responses cannot happen if we do not have access to the finance to make them happen. So all we do is continue to talk about them and plan for them and have the best intentions of mice and men and women, but we can't do what needs to be done because those flows of finance are not taking place. Look at the COVID response. The COVID response saw the G20 countries put $151 billion into fossil fuels. Where is that sensitivity to what needs to happen to marginalized groups, particularly women and girls? So we, despite this being a panel and not having any women on the panel, but we are certainly alert to those issues.
We couldn't salvage it with a female moderator, but...
no, the female moderator is the weight of all of us.
Driving all of us. The only thing I would add, totally agree with your intervention, and of course, because the conversation was such, we didn't bring it out explicitly, but totally aligned. And I would also add that let's not only look at women and girls as somebody who is being affected. We've also seen many examples where their agency has transformed many changes. How do we invest into their leadership? You know, how we recognize their existing leadership is something that also has to be done, and also of all vulnerable communities, or who we define as vulnerable for various structural reasons. They have a lot of power, they have a lot of agency. How we can further boost that?
Wonderful. Yes, please,
yes,
Honorable.
Thank you very much. And whenever we have fora such as this, I always tend to ask myself, and it's so unnatural, why do we meet? And I do think that the reason why we meet in the Commonwealth, in this forum, People's Forum, is so that we achieve what we call as a safe space for humanity. That's why we are trying to come together. So slogans such as "no one should be left behind" should not only be slogans, they should be serious, because we are constantly looking for that safe space for humanity. And in order to achieve that, we have certain key foundations, which are the social foundation, such as water, energy, food, and income, social equity, which is very key, gender equality, health, those are very key. If you leave out any of those social foundation components, then you are not creating a safe space for humanity. On the other hand, we have the environmental ceiling, which includes, of course, climate change, freshwater use, nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, ocean acidification, which my co-panelists have spoken about, chemical pollution, and the land use change. So if you don't deal with those, you can imagine the impact of that, the catastrophe of not dealing with the environmental ceiling. What it means is we won't even be able to talk of the rights, the social foundations, as we speak of them today. So we have to look at it in a holistic way. And that's why it is important to really look at all these components that ensure that we are creating a safe space for humanity. So whatever we do as governments, as civil society organizations, we should have at the back of our mind that we are trying to create a safe space for humanity. And when I still have the microphone, let me talk about how we should strategically deal with the issue of climate change. It is, I do reckon that it is within the DNA of civil society organization to believe that for any social impact that they want to achieve, they should approach it in an agitative manner, confrontational manner. Yes, it works in certain instances, but for questions of climate change, we cannot afford to speak at each other. We have to speak to each other. We have to be in the same room until we get the white smoke on how we deal with climate change. But unfortunately, I've seen that sometimes we tend to not to be strategic on these issues. When someone from the civil society organization is talking to someone in government, then sometimes you're accused of being in cohorts with government. At times you don't have to be in cohorts with government, but I do think that in order to deal with the impacts of climate change, we have to be in the same room, and no one should be left behind in this conversation that we should have. We really do have a small window of opportunity.
Indeed.
We cannot afford to act in silos. We have to be in the same room in this fight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Honorable Minister. I think it's a perfect segue into the call to action, and I want to get from each of you in a minute or less what you'd want the Commonwealth to do, and also bearing in mind COP27 coming up. We've heard from Honorable Minister and what we can do, so I'd like to hear from Maxwell and then Harjit and of course Dr. Fletcher.
Will you allow me to make one extra comment to the Minister?
30 seconds or
30
less.
30 seconds, okay.
Yes.
I think the Minister is absolutely right, and this is where we do share one planet, we have one goal, we have the same children, so our interests are the same. Unfortunately, you know, the world is imperfect. We cannot ignore northern countries, as my honorable friend here is suggesting, because they are the ones who are polluting. So we've got to sit at the table with them. We cannot ignore financial markets from the north, because they are the ones, it's rigged, and we know that. They are the ones with the finances, so we cannot sit on our own. When COVID struck, you know, the northern countries went to the market to borrow money, trillions of dollars at very low interest. African countries went to the market to borrow the same money. The interest rates were extortionate. That's what we've got to solve. Back to the Commonwealth. Back to the Commonwealth. I do think that first we've got to solve the issue of what do we want as a collective here and take it to COP27. That leadership is important. What do we want on issues of loss and damage? What do we want on issues of raising climate finance? What do we want on technology? That has to be a collective voice that we can take together with us. Second, I think that the issue of financing is incredibly important. And I would say at a time when we've got such a problem, we need all the tools in our toolbox. So that includes carbon financing, unfortunately, because governments have been stuck since Paris discussing Article 6, which is important for carbon finance. It's not a distraction. And it's misleading to suggest that a discussion on carbon finance is somehow a distraction on trying to reduce greenhouse gases. It's a misunderstanding. Now, what we need to do as civil society is, if there is that misunderstanding, let's correct it. Let's go and say, actually, this is where governments should go. And we do think that in order to reduce greenhouse gases, this is where the science should go. Being activist about it will not get us far. Let's be constructive.
Hajit?
I think we need to shift away from the spirit of commonwealth to common planet if we really want to save this planet. And what that means that we need to be sharing the resources, we need to be promoting the spirit of collaboration and cooperation, and go with a common strategy to COP27. Thank you.
Thanks. I'll be extremely brief. Sharing experiences, I think, is extremely important. Trying to facilitate some transfer of technology among the various countries that are part of the Commonwealth. And I think most importantly, providing that voice where civil society can speak, because civil society, this is one space, and the Commonwealth Foundation is doing an awesome job there. Providing that space for civil society to have a voice on its own, but also in concert with government. And if we can do that, because the countries of the Commonwealth span so many negotiating blocks, the Commonwealth itself doesn't have a discrete negotiating space, but it has influence on so many negotiating spaces. If we can do that, then we would have done something that hitherto we've not been able to do, which is to get a group of countries, almost like the way we had the High Ambition Coalition form. If the Commonwealth can become that, then perfect.
Thank you so much. A round of applause to my panel for a very engaging discussion. And we want to close out this session with a voice and a face of an individual who knows far too well the impact of climate change on their home. And that is poet Aubrey Brown Pereira. She's from the Cook Islands and New Zealand, and she's giving an emotive and hard-hitting narrative on the themes that we just spoke about in this session. Take a look.
They're taking pictures of us in the water. On the count of 1.5, smile, say cheese. They're taking pictures of us in the water like we are mermaid, wearing white coral and motherless plankton, quilted, illuminous, mysterious, not of this world. They post and share. Submerged still life, just breathing, visible and muted. The sea just below our nose, inhaling water. Islands become mythology, tragedy, and self-rescue in the making, but no myth, no ruins or philosophers of brilliance. Modern-day man want, need, find, take, make, break, throw away and leave behind. Promissory notes in faraway chapeau of negotiated text and international law and science and diplomacy. And make-believe, so we doubt and forget. Make-believe modern-day man not responsible when he the only one eating at the table. Weather patterns changing, harvest times too. Sea become terrestrial, so terrestrial becomes sea. Cannibal-induced climate, climate-induced cannibalism. Ice cream elsewhere be melting. And the living in the sea getting so hot, so hot, so hot. They tired, they hungry, they can't say in front of them. They don't know yet. 30 million square kilometers of our blue Pacific. Brown and black and white and gray, birthing, breathing, being. We people, not a mermaid. We leading the charge for our own self-rescue. Without us, there is no memory of the beginning, middle, or the end. There is nothing. On the count of 1.5, smile. You're not smiling.